Marc Chagall is an artist that's difficult to classify. Here's a quote: "Art to me is a state of soul more than anything else." And I think in many ways that kind of encapsulates his art. His art is difficult to describe. It's very much signature, and his style is very much all his own, which as an artist, I think that's pretty cool. He has a long history of being pretty popular. He was very well known in his lifetime, but today I don't think he has anywhere near the same amount of attention as, per se, artists like Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, and so many others, probably because his work is hard to classify. He kind of gets put in the school of Paris. It's kind of a unique area where the modernists get put that really are hard to classify. So shows abstraction and cubist influence, but very much his own. Imaginative, whimsical colors, themes, and motifs that becomes part of his oeuvre, or oeuvre if you prefer that pronunciation, his signature style. If you walk into a museum and you see a painting with all these floating houses, you might be looking at a Chagall. Green faces, upside down people, lots of imagination and whimsy. It's probably Chagall. His works are often about memory, Russian folklore, and certainly the people in his life are very important to his artworks as well. This is I and the Village, also known as Me and My Village. This is probably perhaps the most famous Chagall. If there's one work that kind of tends to show up in art history textbooks, it's this one of Chagall. But again, he's not easily classified. He's truly not. Let me move on and I'll explain more. So, had a rural childhood, Russia, and grew up in a little village named Vitebsk, and I had to look over for the pronunciation, and dreamlike representation of goats, farmer, a violinist. Lots of violinists show up in his works. Animals do as well. Images of houses, some upside down, a jigsaw puzzle extracted from a child's imagination. So lots of intrigue, symbolism. In the foreground, or middle ground, I guess more specifically, a green-faced man wearing a cross around his neck, a cap on his head, and holding a glowing tree, of course, symbol for life, and he stares at a goat. In the background, there's a row of houses, an Orthodox church, and a man dressed in black carrying a scythe hurries past an upside-down woman playing what appears to be a violin. So again, there's these unique details, but again, people are not entirely sure what they mean. Now, a green face, this is not a new idea. This actually goes far back. There are images of Osiris with a green face in Egyptian art. Green is often a symbol of regeneration, fertility, growth. So he was born in a small Hasidic community in Vitebsk, and this was a working class family. His father was a fishmonger. His mother ran a small sundries and grocery shop. He attended a Jewish elementary school, and he studied Hebrew and the Bible. And the Bible for him becomes a lifelong connection to imagery, and he said it was like poetry to him. And those images show up in his art throughout his life. He begins to learn the fundamentals of drawing at a Russian public school. So 1887 to 1985, he led a nice long life. So Russian born, and a local painter also trained him as well. He spent some time in St. Petersburg, and he studies for a few years in St. Petersburg at the Imperial School for the Protection of the Fine Arts. Kind of a mouthful there. And this was around early 1900s. 1910, 1914, he's in Paris, where he meets Apollinaire, Robert Delaunay, Leger, Modigliani, and he has his first one-man show in 1914. So he had some early success, but he was not still always financially viable, as many of these artists are not in the beginning. So this is his self-portrait with 7 fingers, at least 7 fingers on one hand. I've often wondered if this basically means he needs more fingers than he has to kind of get all these ideas on the canvas. But again, a lot of these, your interpretations are pretty open-ended because he did not like to say a lot about his works. So here's a number of his signatures. He was born Marc Chagall, and he ultimately ends up in France, and after a while he changes his name to a more French spelling. And so he's a Russian, French, Jewish artist. He's an artist, and he lived in the U.S. in the 1940s during the war, and it offered a place of peace for him. So in any case, at least safety as a Jewish man as well. So Fiddler, 1913, and then Green Violinist, 1920s. And I think these are some of his more popular works. They do have a feeling of folk art about them. Simplified forms. They're very imaginative. His technique is not extremely elaborate, but there's something very endearing about his work. And there's those flying people, angels, people, images again of figures upside down. These are all things. A few years back, in 2018, there was an exhibition on Chagall at the Luckman Museum. It was pretty extensive, and it was pretty impressive. I think a lot of people who had never been exposed to Chagall before really kind of fell in love with his artwork at that exhibition. I took a large class to that exhibition as well. So, so music, poetry, and art, these things go together for Chagall. A poetry book was published posthumously that was written by his wife, Bella, his first wife, Bella. And this was also a replica for a mural he did for the Moscow Theater that was an allegorical symbol for music. Family pretty poor at this time, and he was deeply depressed. So I think this also offers a little bit of escape for him. So why green? There is a lot of this deep green in his work, and it's really intriguing that one hand is green, the hand that's essentially plain, and the other one is not. I think that's interesting. So he did have an interest in new art forms, in modernity, but he refused literal interpretations of his paintings. So green perhaps equals life, vegetative growth. The image is nostalgic, like memory, reflects back to Russian village life. But again, it was done before. It was not completely original. And so this is an Egyptian mummiform sarcophagi that is done in a Syriac style with this green face. Sometimes the whole body is green. So this is the god of the dead, resurrection, husband, brother of Isis. Yes, it's complicated. In mythology and in Greco-Roman mythology, as well as Egyptian mythology, sometimes the brother, sister, wife, and daughter roles get changed around in a little bit. Now, part of it is because these are oral traditions, but part of it is just it's kind of like a soap opera. These relationships get really complicated. So just go with the story in general. Chagall's 1910 Fiddler and The Wedding with Fiddler, 1910. They're colorful, they're imaginative. To a certain extent, these look almost like another artist painted it. They do look different. But the motifs are certainly similar. The structure of the trees are certainly similar. Stylistically, there's definitely some similarities. The Chabad Hasidim of Chagall's childhood believed it possible to achieve communion or closer communion with God through music and dance. And so this fiddler was a large part of this. And I also think it's also about memory and childhood and how this must have resonated with him, because this would be a happy memory. So they recur over and over in his work, and certainly reflect his childhood. Violinists were usually traveling musicians that were suggested by the curving road that goes behind them. So his arm mimics the curve of the road, which I think is really kind of interesting. And so this is a summary from a didactic at LACMA that's describing the work. So the work romanticizes his homeland, memory, complementary colors of red and green, they're opposite on the color wheel, also make it visually appealing. He was a fantastic colorist, like Henri Matisse. 1909, Russian Wedding. And so this is an early style, more representational, certainly very different than what becomes his later style. So this is, again, only 2 years later, Wedding with Fiddler, and this is 1920. So again, there's a color storm that's happened in the meantime. So he goes to Paris from Russia in 1910, and his paintings definitely start to reflect modernism, avant-garde styles, cutting-edge styles. In Paris Through the Window, he's also being influenced by the Orphic cubism of Robert Delaunay and his wife Sonia Delaunay. And so there are these overlapping planes. You can see a little cubism certainly in here as well, like again the cubism of Picasso, because he's active in cubism in the 1910s, but primarily in brown tonal colors. The Eiffel Tower also occurs in this cityscape, and that was something that occurred frequently in Delaunay's motifs, and then it starts to also occur frequently in Chagall's works as well. Note the two faces. Could this be Russian Chagall and French Chagall? I kind of think that interpretation works myself, because it would be such a very different world for him. This would be certainly an adjustment. He did love it, but again, I still think it would be very, very different. So again, if I was to analyze it, that's what I would say. But it's also this kind of Janus figure as well. So Robert Delaunay was 4 years old when the Eiffel Tower was erected in Paris in the public space known as the Champ de Mars. One of the many artists who depict this landmark, Delaunay did a series. This is Red Tower, 1911, and then we also have Eiffel Tower with trees. I think Red Tower is the one that is much more well known. But this idea of cubism was to show different sides of space at the same time on a flat plane. So he returned to this theme more than 30 times, and it was built for the Exposition Universelle of Paris in 1889. So Orphic Cubism or Orphism. In 1912, Apollinaire applied the term Orphism to the visionary and lyrical paintings of Delaunay, relating them to Orpheus, a poet and musician in Greek mythology that's associated with sleep. So this is Delaunay's Circular Forms. Now, if you notice the little floating man again, now initially you go, oh, Chagall is a floating man, big surprise. But this one may actually refer to a parachutist that this successful jump occurred in 1912. Other motifs suggest Vitebsk, but again, this painting is an enlarged version of a window view in a self-portrait painted 1 year earlier. So he contrasts his birthplace with Paris. And so the Janus figure has also been read as the artist looking at once westward to his new home in France and then eastward to Chagall. But again, Chagall refused to basically make these symbols clear. So Janus is also the god of beginnings, transitions, duality. Certainly all of these things were changes that were occurring in his life. So certainly that works as an interpretation as well. Can there be more than one interpretation? Absolutely. The cat's a little unusual. The cat looks pretty personified. And then, of course, you also have some of the floating people right behind the Janus figure as well. So the city of Paris had a magnetic attraction for artists around this time. There was so much going on, so many ideas being exchanged. Painters, sculptors, writers, and they were gathering in Montparnasse and Montmartre. And again, this was sprinkled with galleries and studios and cafes. And so these this was a time of tremendous growth in art history, in France especially. Paris, city for lovers and dreamers alike, and this has been an inspiration for artists for centuries. And Chagall, of course, uses the motif of the Eiffel Tower as a symbol for Paris, and it shows up over and over and over again in his artworks. As do chickens, as do brides, but we'll get there. So this is Marc Chagall, a portrait by Yehuda Penn, 1914. Penn was his teacher, and so he had a 7-decade career. I mean, he lived to be 97 years old. His works have a huge variation: lyrical, figurative work. He worked with theater, costumes, murals, stained glass, multifaceted, gifted artist, and also a printmaker, but he believed art, music were closely related. Daphnis and Chloe. This is some of the costumes that were hand-painted on the material while being worn, because he wanted to see how the fabric moved, which I think is pretty fascinating. And this is an image from the exhibition at the LACMA. Queen of the Night. And so this is the only opera for which Chagall ever designed sets and costumes, Mozart's Magic Flute. And this was presented by the Met Opera in 1967. And so costume for Magic Flute, and with this incredible headdress. The images are really remarkably imaginative. And again, you can see the details in the backgrounds and the details on the costumes, and it does very much look signature Chagall. A variation on Magic Flute theme, gouache, colored pencil on paper. Gouache is watercolor with Chinese chalk, more of a matte finish than a watercolor, less transparent, a little bit more control than you have with watercolor. And flowers was definitely a motif that he absolutely loved. They show up over and over and over again in his works, especially when his works include women, and a large number of them do. You could wonder for hours what flowers mean, but for me, they're life itself, in all its happy brilliance. We couldn't do without flowers. Flowers help you forget life's tragedies. And you remember, he's going through a difficult time in history as well. So, costume for Daphnis and Chloe play the god Pan. Knit, animal furs, leather, silk, foliage, fake hair. This was really remarkable. The textures were really wild. Pan ruled over the shepherds and was wild, often chasing nymphs, beautiful nymphs, and more. Ruled over nature, kind of a sexualized creature. And he's quoted as saying, "Love and fantasy go hand in hand." Aphrodite with Pan and Eros. So Hellenistic. This is at the full development of the Greco-Roman sculpture. It looks so natural. The movement looks so natural. Aphrodite holds her left hand in front of herself modestly, trying to cover or protect with her palm from the indiscreet intentions of Pan. She brandishes her sandal in her raised right hand to deter him. But she does look kind of playful if you look at her expression. She doesn't look like she's going to just beat him. It's a little bit playful. And then you also have Eros right above her. This, of course, is offspring of Aphrodite as well. And so, but Pan, of course, is an important creature in the magic flute. And here you can see the costumes as well. Chagall's red nude sitting. So his work is emotional, poetic, mixes styles, typically happy themes. Chagall saw his work as not the dream of one people, but of all humanity. And there is a resonance in his works. There is a sense that so many people can appreciate his work. There is a sense of it being cross-cultural. In the arts, as in life, everything is possible, provided it is based on love. So he was hesitant to join any art groups, to align himself with the Cubist or the Surrealist. He wanted to distance himself from these categorizations. And I think to a certain extent that has made it difficult for him to be taught in the schools, because he is not easily categorized. He's not easily put in this section or that section or this section. So I think for that reason he sometimes gets overlooked. But he shouldn't. He was truly a unique and stylistic artist. Here he's shown with his wife Bella, his first wife Bella, and his daughter Ida right behind him. The Birthday, 1910s. This is one of my favorites. So many people believe this is one of his more distinctive, important works. And a lot of them, I think, were produced in the 1910s. Here he is shown literally head over heels. He adored his wife Bella. It is said that while he was working, she would bring him drinks. She would bring him little cakes. He felt very well taken care of with Bella. So Bella lived 1895 to 1944. Again, she was his first wife and died fairly young. She ended up dying of a virus. But again, this feeling of joy, this feeling of connection, you definitely get this in this work. I also love the mix of colors and textures and the unique vantage point in his work. It's very whimsical. There are few more vivid evocations of how it feels to fall for someone than in Chagall's ecstatic paintings of his wife. I thought that said it very nicely. And this is a detail from The Lovers. Chagall, drawing of Bella, 1910s. Bella with white collar, 1917. You can see a photograph and kind of see it in context with his work as well. So now his family was working class, and he was the oldest of 9 children. Her father was a jeweler, and they had high hopes for their daughter. After the baby Ida was born 9 months after the wedding, that helped their relationship considerably with his in-laws. She was the 8th child, so he's the oldest, she's the youngest, and so as far as birthplace, they were probably a good match, because she was used to being the younger sibling, he was used to being the in-charge older sibling. Her family was quite well-to-do, and so again, acceptance didn't come immediately. So 1909, she meets Marc Chagall at a party at her friend's. This, of course, becomes pivotal to both of them and very much important. But Moishi was recognized by no one. He was poor, but Bella definitely saw something in him. She believed in him. So she was also a talented and creative writer, and her description of their first encounter is like a Chagall painting in words. I like the way this was said. When you did catch a glimpse of his eyes, they were as blue as if they'd fallen straight out of the sky. They were strange eyes, long, almond shape, and each seemed to sail along by itself like a little boat. So this is early 1920s. By all accounts, they were a happy couple. Her silence is mine, her eyes mine. I feel she has known me always, my childhood, my present life, my future. I knew this is she, my wife, her pale coloring, her eyes, how big and round and black they are. They are my eyes, my soul. Interesting, they're both very writing at length about each other's eyes. Bella in green dress, and they married 6 years after they met, so they did know each other for a number of years before they got married. So again, she was one who catered to him a bit, bringing him food, cakes, fish, boiled milk, colorful fabrics, which that would, of course, would be inspirational for an artist, wood for me to use as an easel. All I had to do was open my window and in-stream the blueness of the sky, love and flowers with her. Dressed all in white or all in black, she has long been haunting my paintings, the central image of my art. And that's pretty much true for his lifetime, because he does recur, even after her death, he does return to the subject of Bella. Rather endearing photographs. We have a few, which is lovely. The Promenade, 1918. So he worked in a variety of media, but is most renowned for his paintings. In his time, he was considered the foremost Jewish artist in the world and has been referred to as the quintessential Jewish artist of the world. Now, in a perfect world, it would just be the quintessential artist of the world. Why do we need all these labels? But for now, they still are there. But he's very much known for these brilliant color to attract attention, lively, imaginative. The palette here is lovely, the pink juxtaposed with that deep green, and the rolling heels, and they of course are larger than life themselves. And again, I think this also looks very much like folk art. So he goes from one precarious commission to another. The synagogues were closed. The secret police were raiding Bella's family jewelry shop. The couple joined Russia's cultural exodus to Berlin and then to Paris. So he leaves Russia in 1922, never to return, except through his paintings, his memories. But his works, I think to a certain extent, you do feel like you're looking at a diary sometimes. Memory of Spring and Memory of Paris, but Paris stole his heart as well. And here you see another picture of the two together. So, gorgeous colorist, his work defies easy classification. Very attractive young man as well. So what is artistic success? He rose from obscurity, a Jewish man in Tsarist Russia. He becomes a multimillionaire, a global art celebrity. He was internationally known. So he was in Paris in the 1910s, an important time period. He was in revolutionary Russia. He was in 1920s Berlin. He was also one of the degenerate artists as well. So Hitler certainly included some of his works in the degenerate art exhibition, unfortunately. Popular taste canonized him in old age as a founder with Henri Matisse and Picasso of French modernism, or School of Paris, again, different labels. Patrons for his commissions included the Catholic Church, the Israeli state, the Rockefellers, the Paris Opera, and the United Nations. That's pretty diverse. So, by mid-1920s, he was pretty successful, but again, very poor before that. Art critic Pierre Schneider Chagall absorbed Cubism, Fauvism, Surrealism, Expressionism. I can see a lot of Expressionism in his work, and other trends as well. But he only used them for his own aesthetic purposes. And I think he very much is very much true to himself. But again, he cannot be pigeonholed. He is hard to label. This is Lovers of Venice, where again they lived for a time as well. So here again we have that green face, the ancient Egyptian form sarcophagi with green vegetative fertility imagery, which goes very well with a bridal portrait. And also associated with the giver of life, agriculture, bounty, so these beautiful vegetative greens. I think they make kind of sense, really. This is a limited palette, all done in blues primarily, maybe in grays, some white. And so this was a little unusual, this limited palette. There's brighter colors showing through the white paint that suggest he reused an old canvas. Pierre Matisse, the son of Henri Matisse, coveted the works of Chagall since 1924 when he first met the artist. He was loath to part with this work, but in 1941, Pierre, who then owned an art gallery in New York, set up an exhibition for Chagall that became an important blockbuster. But brides preoccupied Chagall through much of his life and was a motif he returns to over and over and over again. This one looks a little darker than most of them, though. Most of them look much lighter. This one has a much more serious look. Marriage, 1918. The muted palette with the deep red angel, I think, is very striking. And then the image on her cheek, you just wonder if this is this a hope for children? What is this a symbol of? And then you also have the fiddler. You also have a tree of life that just has a few branches that are starting to bloom. Let's see, Bride with Two Faces, 1927. And this is pretty large. This is 99 by 73 inches. It's in a private collection. So, but he did not wish to be in a particular category. Bride and Groom with Eiffel Tower. Again, they're floating. So he said he was a dreamer who never woke up. People have sought to decrypt his symbols. said one director of the Chagall Biblical Message Museum in Nice. But there's no consensus on what they mean. They're simply part of his world, figures from a dream. So the rooster may be a symbol of fertility, whimsy, plenty, having enough. Hard to know. A certain amount of freedom as they kind of float away. And here we have this angel fiddler right below them as well. Bride and groom on cock, 1939 to 1947. Do I think there's a little bit of a pun here? I do. Newlyweds flying away after the wedding. Bride and groom under the canopy. And here again, there's flowers, there's love. And the woman's face is interesting in that she looks like two people. So you just wonder the symbolism there. Is this bride a combination of women in this groom's mind, or you just wonder? In our life, there's a simple color, as on an artist's palette, which provides the meaning of life and art. It's the color of love. There's a chuppah, which was a tapestry attached to the tops of 4 poles. It's a covering or protection, and it's intended as a roof or covering for the bride and groom. Bridal couples are united under a canopy. In Jewish weddings, it also symbolizes the home that the couple will make together. And of course, their home was a transitory home because, of course, they lived in several places. Now, Bella passes away in New York, and he painted this wedding that is very much darker in its approach than other works. Certainly the colors are deeper, and this is 1944. So, and for a while after death, he did not paint at all. I've read around 6 months. It shows the marriage of Bella's brother Aaron, but there is a sinister melancholy. Angel musicians may be playing a death march as a wedding dance. Private grief added to world events are also centered on the death of Bella. And this is from Walther and writing on Chagall. Bride and groom with red canopy, Midsummer Night Dream, 1939. There's one thing I really want to understand is the goat imagery. And it's not really been decoded. Again, I think it's folklore, but it is interesting. Bella with a book and 3 candles, late 1930s, 1940. They're just so whimsical and playful, and you just don't know where to look. I just think his works are gorgeous. A lot of these are huge, too. When you see them in a museum setting, you're really struck by how huge they are. Wedding Candles, 1945. This was produced after Bella's death, so it can be read differently knowing this information. And then you have a green violinist in the foreground as well. You have a chicken in the bottom, and then you have a woman with long dark hair, and she's being protectively covered by the groom. And again, this deep blue that kind of reminds me of memory. And then, of course, you have the sense that it's looking back. So, Wedding Candles. I don't generally quote Aaron Brothers, but I liked this. I thought it really says it very, very well. And this is Chagall's 1950s The Bride. His paintings are rich in myth. His airborne humans, monsters, animals defy the laws of gravity, and they tell stories of mythic proportions. Like fairy tales, images all put together, float together through our intellectual thinking. They tap into our essence as humans. As a result, we clearly understand his message. I don't know that we clearly understand it, but we strive to understand it. Initially, Chagall adopted Cubism, but found its style too preoccupied with physical appearance of things to suit him. And I think that's true. I think his work definitely touches on the spiritual and abstract. His daughter Ida introduced 30-year-old Virginia to Chagall when he was 58. She was married and became his housekeeper. She became his lover and had his child David in 1946. She was with him for 7 years and ultimately left her husband and Chagall. She could not compete with Bella's memory. He painted her again all his life. He was not married to Virginia. He did briefly marry a second wife, and that was Valentina Brodsky. So she came from a millionaire sugar grower, and so by all accounts, they were quite happy. She cooked him Russian meals as well. So Chagall's wife, Valentina, or Vava, and speaks to him in Russian. He takes her hand and presses it to him. I love my wife very much, you know. And all at once his piercing gaze softens to that of a contented child. And this is from Architectural Digest. He was interviewed in 1997. So this was near the end of his life. So 1955, Vava by Chagall. And this is Chagall's studio in the south of France. Really rather beautiful and pretty organized, I have to say. Not all artist studios are organized. Bride and Groom, 1976. Chagall's Bouquet, 1982. And again, flowers are a recurring motif. So he spends the 20s in early 20s in Berlin, and then 23 to 40 he goes back to Paris, except for visits to Egypt, Palestine, Holland, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And so he made illustrations for La Fontaine's Fables and the Bible, which his work is perfect for. In the U.S., as a refugee from 1941 to 47, he goes to France, settling in 1950 at Vence. His later works include a new ceiling painting for the Paris Opera and a number of commissions in stained glass. And I'm also going to include some really good clips on the artist as well. There's some also from Sotheby's that I really liked. So he led a wandering life, not always of his own choice. And so, again, he travels the world. He said he loved the feeling of youth in America, but some of his finest stained glass is the Blue Series, which was privately commissioned for All Saints Church in Tudley, Kent. U.S. sold for over $4 million to an Asian buyer after a heated competition. It set a new record as the most expensive painting by a modern Western artist ever sold at auction in Asia. And this is Bestiary of Music, 1960s. So Bestiary is a book of real fabulous animals. Very different than a lot of his work, so the palette's quite unique. What a genius Picasso is. It's a pity he cannot paint. I think it's interesting that the picture I found shows him in the ceramics, shows Picasso in the ceramics factory that he was doing some work in later in his life. And I have to say, when I've looked at some of those works, they're not Picasso's best. Not at all. Indeed, for a long time on eBay, you could purchase them for between $5,000 and $10,000. Now, be advised, Picasso works tend to be fake. It's very easy to fake Picassos. He's supposedly the #1 most fraudulent produced works are Picasso's. One likes France, but falls in love with Italy. France was very important to his art. He once said how he'd grown to dislike the dark and sludgy color of Russia, like its footwear. France gave him bright colors, reds, and strong tones. In the South, he meets Picasso in 1964 for lunch. So this had been anxiously put together and organized, but he found Picasso was tiresome. He kept asking Chagall why he never went back to his native Soviet Union. Perhaps there was no money there, Picasso said. Chagall had fled Stalin and the persecution of his fellow Jews. He never bothered to see Picasso again. But for a brief moment in time, they were indeed friends. So fanciful images of blue cows, flying lovers, biblical prophets, green-faced fiddlers. He had a firm idea of who he was and what he wanted to accomplish. But when it came to guarding his privacy, he was a master of deflection, and I love this. Sometimes, when people approached to ask if he was that famous painter, Marc Chagall, he would answer, no, or more absurdly, I don't think so, or point to someone else and say slyly, maybe that's him. And so he could be pretty endearing, I think. When he died in St. Paul on Devents on March 28, 1985, at 97, he was still working, still the avant-garde artist who refused to be modern. That was the way he said he wanted it, to stay wild, untamed, to shout, to weep, to pray. And so this is Lovers, which sold for $28.5 million in November 2017. And then here's a Chagall greeting card that is numbered. So in general, the lower numbers out of a grouping is what you want, because generally speaking, the detail is better on those prints. Only love interests me, and I am only in contact with things that revolve around love. If I create from the heart, nearly everything works. If I create from the head, almost nothing. I love this quote. And so, Marc Chagall.